Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. Well, Gary, welcome to the Consumer Code Podcast. Gary is the founder of Applied Geographic Solutions for almost 30 years now. So if you are a researcher and have ever used demographics, there's a good chance that your decisions were based on the data that Gary supplies. And even there's a better chance that Gary has influenced the methodology that has been used to create those demographic reports. So I am going to expect this is going to be a two-part episode. In part one, I want to explore Gary's career because it maps perfectly onto the inventions that underpin market research today and in site selection. And then part two, I want to talk about demographics today as it pertains to retail market researchers and how we can be better informed by the number one source that we use to impact retail business decisions today. And Gary is an absolute expert on demographics. So let's get right into it, Gary. I'm excited about this. The first question I want to ask you is what possesses a kid living in the sticks east of Toronto to study geography?
You know, most of the kids that I knew collected hockey cards. I started collecting maps when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. There was just something about the unleashing of the imagination that you could take that paper map and imagine places all over the world. You know, I was the kid who eagerly waited for that National Geographic issue to show up at my door. The ones with the map inserts that showed you everything about the world. And you know, I was the kid who sat with the map on family trips. It just was my nature. I really can't remember a time when I wasn't fascinated by the concept of a map. You know, if you asked me when I was 10 years old what I was going to do, I would have said that I was going to be a geography professor. That was the career path that I was on, and I was on that until kind of the fateful day when I wasn't. You know, I was pretty young. I was like 23, almost finished a PhD, and I got offered a tenure stream job at Queen's University in Ontario. And at the time, its geography department was one of the best. And the chairman of the department basically is offering me this job. And I said, I'm going to have to think about it. And I don't know where those words came from, but I had been working part-time for this company called CompuSearch in Toronto. And I got home, and the next morning I went into CompuSearch and I said, okay, I'm here. And they said, we've been expecting you. We've got this fancy IBM PCXT, brand new, waiting for you. And they had an office ready for me. They knew I was coming. The only one who didn't know I was coming was me.
When I think about like the retail landscape and in research, I always feel like I get pointed back here to CompuSearch, and a lot of the people that are playing today came from CompuSearch. So what was CompuSearch doing at that time, and then who were you working with there?
Bill Goldstein, who started it, he was a geography student at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, and when the first digital census came out, so in 1970 was the first digital U.S. census. That's when you saw companies like Claritas and NPDC start up. The 71 census in Canada came out on magtape, and Bill basically was watching what they were doing in the U.S. And
real quick, what is magtape? Because that's before I was born.
They're probably 16-inch discs with half-inch tape on them. And
Okay.
they were obviously sequential read-only. And you could buy the census for the cost of those tapes plus processing.
So what was Bill Goldstein doing with them, and what opportunity did he see?
Well, he wrote a little program that would extract demographics for a 135-mile radius. It was all just straight up trade area reports using the census. I think NPDC did the same thing. Claritas took a bit of a different approach in that they went the segmentation route right away.
Hmm.
Um, in Canada, CompuSearch, we did that in 1985. Created this system that we called lifestyles. Um, just the the technology that was there at the time. We created this system with 72 segments in it.
And was this
48
for
were,
Canada only? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
48 of them were urban, 24 were rural. And we cooked up an explanation as to why we did it that way. The reality was that we couldn't, with the amount of memory available on the computers that we had, we couldn't invert a matrix big enough to do it all at once. So we split it into urban and rural.
Oh, so is a geodemographic with K means two splits? Yeah,
Yeah.
you did the urban first and you did the rural second. And I was about to say, like, that is a fine grain for rural, really.
Oh, it was.
You know?
It was too many. Um, but Canada was at the time less urbanized, and by rural we meant basically everything outside of the big cities.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just truly rural. It was, we could have done an English-French split, but we decided against it. That showed up anyway.
Sure.
That linguistic divide. But um,
So we were on Bill Goldstein. So he develops he buys the mag tapes from the census, and basically he's developing 135-mile radiuses. Who are we selling that to at this point?
it was primarily directly to retailers.
Okay.
Um, and it was brand new. So you had to convince the retailers that there was value in this. For the first 10 years, we viewed ourselves as much as anything as evangelists for data.
Hmm.
Because you'd go into a retailer and you'd say, look, we can show you the demographics of the area around this store. Call it a trade area, call it whatever you like. But they would say, well, why would we do that? We have Earl. And Earl was that old crusty real estate guy that nobody liked. But when Earl went out to a site, he'd look at it and he'd go yes or no based on how it felt to him. And Earl was good, right? I mean, we all know that kind of person who they just look at a location, they go, no, this will never fly, or this is a good location. What we ended up saying to people was, look, I wouldn't trade Earl for data any day. Keep Earl. Here's your problem. There are only 7 Earls in Canada. You can't send Earl out to every potential site. What we can do, though, is you can use the data to screen out the stuff that Earl is going to say no to. So that Earl is focused only on sites that truly have some potential, and let him go by gut feel or whatever it is that he does. And you'll you'll be better off. You'll Earl will be happier.
Yeah.
And I think that's still true. That I've never thought that you should replace human intuition and intelligence with data. That
Yep.
they complement each other. It
Yep.
allows you as that analyst who's looking at the data to screen out a lot of things that you just waste your time on.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. So back to CompuSearch. When you think about CompuSearch and starting your career there, what would you say the role CompuSearch played in the industry? Because CompuSearch today is not basically it's not what it was. What yeah, what did that create in the industry with that company?
well, at the time. I mean, it was a new industry everywhere. Basically simultaneously started up in the United States and the UK, Canada a year later, mainly because the census came out a year later.
Hmm.
But we were all at the time this strange mix of people who most of us came out of academic world, and we had a certain uh, collaborative approach to the world. So we would collaborate with the people at Claritas or at CCN in the UK and CACI, all these companies. We all knew each other. We were all kind of watching what each other was doing and trying to be innovative. And I think at the time, what was really cool was that we were all trying to push the envelope in different directions. And there was less of a concern about profitability and sales growth and everything else than there was about let's do some really cool things. When Bill brought Tony on board, it was because he wanted to get out of the, here's a report, here's a ranking of census tracts according to your criteria, and we started getting into location models pretty heavily, and taking the things that were coming out of what was called the quantitative revolution in geography, where something like a spatial interaction model was heavily talked about at the time. Tony and I basically started implementing these things and finding clients to work with it. We probably lost money for CompuSearch most of the time, because Bill would allow us to go down these routes just to see if we could innovate things and create new things. And, a lot of neat things came out of that. In retrospect, we didn't have a chance to do it because the computing capabilities weren't there. We'd have models that would calibrate for a week that I could do in under a minute now. So we were really pushing things and stretching things, and we would talk to clients and they'd say, here are my problems. And we go, well, let's give it a go. Let's see if we can solve it for you. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was a very exciting time because we were allowed to basically push the edges on everything.
Yeah.
And
So when you say the models, are you talking about building a predictive model on sales for retailers? Is that what you're talking about?
well, we had the audacity to imagine that you could not only predict the total retail sales if you put a site at a certain location, but you could say what percentage of the sales came from each census tract. Where did it get the sales from? Did it take them from competitors, or were they cannibalizing your own sales?
Sure.
Um, I mean, those models, I probably still have the code for them.
Well, I
That
mean, when you say yeah, the audacity, I mean, you did. I mean, if they had loyalty data, you could totally do those things, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure that you can do them all that much better than we could then. You can just do them faster. Um,
Yeah.
I, One of the things that I think where we made mistakes was that we imagined that there was one solution to a problem. And these days I would say, look, build 20 different models and take the median value of the results.
Hmm.
Relying on one model, sooner or later that model is going to spit out something really stupid.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
If if you've got other models that use different criteria, well, you probably are going to avoid the blunder. I've always thought that the biggest thing that you want to do is avoid blunders,
Sure.
right? There's no such thing as finding an optimal site. It might be optimal at the time, but 6 months later, your competitor is going to open two doors down, and it's no longer the optimal site,
Mm-hmm.
right? People are chasing this imaginary optimal network. It doesn't exist. So what you want to do, I think, is you want to find this mix between finding the really good sites and especially avoiding blunders.
Yeah. So tell me if I got this right. So CompuSearch, the role that they played in the industry is Bill Goldstein, the first time, got census data from Canada and gets it essentially in a digital format such that retailers, for the first time, can do 1 3 5 mile radiuses around locations and know the demographics. Okay, and they're probably doing a proxy model. Here's my best sites. Give me all the dissemination areas in Canada where I can find more like this. But then you and Tony Lee took it a step further by actually, and probably other folks on the team, by building predictive models. Is there any other role or foundational building block that was built in CompuSearch that continue to play a role?
Well, it's funny. It kind of went away for a long time, in a way. So in Canada, the postal code gets you right down to a block face, a couple, dozen houses.
Let me pause you. With postal code, as in like your postal code where you deliver mail?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
as opposed to your zip code. So the U.S. came up with the zip code system, what, 1960s. Canada came along and said, well, that's good, but we can do better. And created this system where even a few floors in an apartment building would be its own postal code. You combine that with the fact that if Canadian walks into a retailer and they're at the cash register and you say, "What's your postal code?" Your average Canadian is polite and will just give it to you. And we were doing studies back then that basically looked very much like the mobile phone data these days, where
Yeah.
you're pulling the set of points for each location. And we built routines to say, okay, well, that's a sample. So can we predict the complete trade area from the sample using density
Yeah.
measures? And then we'd contour it and we'd say, here's your 60% trade area, here's your 80% trade area. So we were doing those things back in the 80s. It took a while. We did this one project where it was a convenience store and they had about 800 locations across the country. And we actually sent a field team out to all of them, to try and get a feel. We were trying to simulate what Earl would do. You remember Earl, our crusty site guy. But every single one of these locations, every customer who came in, they'd ask them their postal code. So at the end of it, we had hundreds of thousands of points,
Mm-hmm.
and we could define a trade area, based on the density of those points. What we didn't have was a way to predict that trade area, which I think we do now, but I haven't seen anybody doing it. So a lot of those things that are now kind of commonplace, we were doing back in the 1980s with really, you computing equipment that just didn't get you there.
Yeah. I mean, that's a critical component is developing the accurate trade area around the location, because that is the basis from which you can look at every other variable. And if you get the trade area wrong, you're analyzing a surface that is not relevant to your business. So that's
Yeah,
obviously very critical.
and what we found in some of these, I remember one project where it was a big mall that had opened up, and they were having a hard time retaining their retailers. So we did this study of it, and what we discovered was that their trade area didn't even include the mall itself. The area right around this mall, they had positioned the mall in such a way that the people who lived right around it weren't going. And to me, that was a big revelation that you know if you just drop a radius around it, you could be dead wrong. And in this case, it was because the character of the mall didn't match the characteristics of the local neighborhood. It
What was
matched
it?
the
A high
character.
income mall in a low income neighborhood?
Yeah, pretty much. Um, and in fact, their trade area was entirely biased in one direction. So kind of east of the mall, they got nothing. And what it meant for them is they had to change the flavor of the mall in order to keep it afloat. So, some of those things that just, the data really exposes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that's almost. I think about some of these fundamental laws. One is Tobler's law, so everything that is in close proximity is more related than other things that are less in less proximity to each other. And then there's this other. So that's one force going for them all. And then there's this other powerful force which is so hard to quantify, and that's why art is so important. Is on the Huff model, the attractiveness variable, right? And which to me is endlessly confusing. How do you quantify the attractiveness? But what's happening there is that the mall is attractive, but
yeah.
not to the people that are in close proximity. So, so I was actually talking about when the to someone when the Tobler's law is in reverse. That's not necessarily in reverse, but they are at odds with each other.
So, it's funny. Some of these names, I actually remember these guys. Um,
Yeah,
because they were kind of that first generation of quantitative geography that came out of the University of Chicago. And
yeah,
the second generation was a lot larger. These guys they all got PhDs in the 1960s, and that's the generation that I learned from.
yeah. But that's. I feel like Tobler is to you as Gary Menger is to me.
Wow.
So I get to feel the benefit of picking up some of your vibe, likely how you picked up some of his vibe. I'm thinking of another person that's kind of an original in the industry that I've had in this podcast before, which is Richard Weber. It was around this time that you interacted with Richard Weber. For the audience, he developed CACI's Acorn segmentation
Yeah.
and what eventually became the original Experian Mosaic segmentation in England. How did that interaction come to pass?
I'm not even really sure why Richard was there. But I met Richard probably in 1985. He was in North America, came up to Toronto to meet with us, and he was pitching something that at the time, I mean, it sounded great. It was something called superclusters, where I think he'd already moved on from Acorn, and had built this thing where it was 300 segments,
Oh my gosh.
and the thought was that every single client would basically build their own amalgamations of those segments into something that really worked for them.
Okay.
Um, it, that didn't go anywhere. It was too hard for people to think about, and
Hmm.
it was too many segments. We still have this problem even with a segment count of 50 or 60 when you link to something like the MRI Simmons survey, where you've got um, a response which is rare. So only 1% of the households say own a you know pick some weird car, a Bentley. When you get a positive response in a segment, it's likely to be the only one. If you get two, you're going to get an index which is so high that people will go, oh, well, we just need to mark it here. But the 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 likelihood is that yes, it's a good target, but the numbers are so extreme, and if you change the response by one, the index would change completely.
Yep.
Or worse yet, you get somebody in a with a Bentley who is in a segment which you wouldn't expect it, and they've got one, and all of a sudden you're targeting segment 42 when you shouldn't be.
Hmm.
So you've got to be really careful that you don't have expected values in each of these cells that are too small, or else you just can't
Talk,
interpret it.
talking about MRI's survey, when you developed lifestyles at CompuSearch, were you appending that to survey data at the beginning?
No, no, it was purely based on the demographics. Um, and in fact, all of those systems were. You didn't use that data up front. We would link it in afterwards.
Well, I
Um,
mean, yeah, I would say you guys still wouldn't link it in early on today, right? There's not enough sample size. It's always
right,
afterwards, right?
right.
But were you appending it afterwards from the beginning?
Yeah, probably within a couple of years of creating it, we were linked up to a few of the surveys that were being done in Canada. Um, and they give you good results, but you have to interpret them carefully. So, the example that I would have used was, they asked the question, "Do you own a snowmobile?" And you're going to get demographic patterns. So there's a certain demographic that will own snowmobiles. But if they live in Victoria, British Columbia, they probably don't have one, right? It's very useful data in helping kind of round out the edges of how you can expect people to behave. But you have to understand enough about the mechanics of how that survey was done and how it's translated onto the ground so that you don't misinterpret or overinterpret.
So when I'm thinking about CompuSearch, you were basically at the beginning of the development of demographics digitally, developing models, trade areas, and geodemographic segmentation. All of those, you got the first person view, and then you move on to GDSS. And I actually don't even know what GDSS is. So tell me about that switch and what were you working on?
Um, so CompuSearch grew from, I think I was employee number 8 to about 120 employees within 5, 6 years. When it got to 40 employees, I was already uncomfortable. At 120, I didn't want any part of it. As the company grew, our focus had to become increasingly on sales and profitability. And the company became less and less innovative because they were more careful. And so what happened is that myself and one of the other senior guys, we were both feeling very uncomfortable in this company, and we basically left. Um, wasn't abruptly. It was a negotiated exit. I agreed that I would continue to build the demographics for them. Somewhere between 1985 and 1988, Tony and I, when we were building these models, um, realized that one of the problems was that we didn't have current estimates. So one of the big transitions was going from just straight up, here's the census data, to building our own demographics. And we built our own demographics because we refused to believe that our models weren't good, right? So it's like we blamed the data. So we went, all right, let's build our own data, and then the models will be better. Um, so I started this transition from being a retail modeling guy to being a demographic estimates and projections guy. So when we left CompuSearch, we contracted with them. I continued to do that data. So that was our kind of core source of funding for this company. In a way, we didn't know what we wanted to do. And so we ended up doing GIS feasibility consulting for county and city governments. But we also we had the Canadian rights to sell Atlas GIS. It's a product that most won't have heard of. Late 80s, there were 3 contenders for the commercial GIS: ArcInfo, MapInfo,
Map
and
info
Atlas
and
GIS.
okay.
Atlas GIS, we actually thought was the best of them. They made some mistakes, and their big mistake was they didn't adopt the Windows platform. It was still an MS-DOS program, um, but it had some really, really good features for the time. And so, we were selling that. We were, doing consulting work. We were just basically making a living. We had a lot of fun. And then what happened, of course, is that Bill Goldstein. By this time, CompuSearch was owned by a company called Blackburn Marketing Group, um, old newspaper family in London, Ontario. So they had newspapers and radio stations and televisions, and they branched into what would now be called the analytics world. we didn't call it that then because it didn't have a name, but um, Bill bought a company in Los Angeles called Urban Decision Systems, and it was one of the originals in the US. Um,
Wow. Okay, this is new to me.
and Urban Decision Systems, started around the same time as Claritas and NPDC. Um, and by the early 90s, they were in some deep financial trouble. So Blackburn Marketing Services bought UDS. Bill called me up and he basically said, "Hey, little boy, did you ever think about living in Southern California?" And he picked the right time of year to do it. And I was like, "Why not?" And so I picked up and moved to the United States, and um, my job was to turn this company around. And the biggest problems with it were that they were still using technology from what was then a bygone era. Our biggest monthly bill was time sharing on an IBM 360. Um, when we processed the 1990 census, we got a bill for something outrageous like $175,000 in computing time, and it just wasn't workable. So what I ended up doing was I converted our entire production system by rewriting it as a set of Windows applications, where we could have somebody sitting at a desk locating the site. It would create the map for them, and the reports would run somewhere else. And most of what we did then was faxed. And so it automatically would assemble the reports and the maps and fax them. And we managed to kind of go from losing 25 cents on the dollar to double the sales and making 40% profit within a very short period of time. So, I kind of ignored everything that they'd ever done, and started from scratch. And it was UDS was great until it wasn't, and it wasn't because what happened. Blackburn was a family-owned business, and the I think she was fourth or fifth generation. So her name was Martha Blackburn, and she's in charge of this company. And she had a heart attack while water skiing. She was in her late 40s, completely unexpected. Well, her kids lawyered up, so she had three, you know, late teenage, early 20s. They hired some attorneys, and the attorneys basically went to the board of directors and said, "Look, if you guys ever lose a dime on one of these companies, we're going to sue you."
Hmm.
Board of directors went, "All right, we're out of here," and decided to sell everything. And we thought that we were going to be sold to CCN in the UK, which became Experian. So Richard Weber, same
Hmm.
guy, we're talking to him thinking, okay, this is going to be a great marriage. We're going to be with Richard and Paul Watts and a few of the other people from there. And something went wrong in that deal. And Claritas won the bid somehow. We didn't even know that they were in the running until they were. And Claritas came along and they bought UDS and promptly dismantled it. Um,
Hmm.
so it was bought somewhere around Christmas, 1995 or yeah. And I was summoned into the offices on January 2nd and promptly, they put a blindfold on and executed me. Um, and they did that across the board. And so here I am. I've got three small children. I'm not in my native country. Um, and what do you do?
What
And
did you do from there?
um, well, I looked at it and I went, okay, I guess I'm on my own. So that's when I started AGS. I started AGS not because I really wanted to. I started AGS because I had to. Because here I was, it's like I'm really not suitable to be employed by most companies. I don't like rules. I don't follow rules. Um, I want to innovate and do things that you know most companies just really don't want that kind of loose cannon running around. And so I started AGS, and my first product wasn't demographics. Um, it was a drive time model. So I actually created the first commercial isochrone drive time polygon creator. It was kind of challenging because you had to fit everything onto a CD-ROM. So you had to take the entire street network and jam it onto a CD. Otherwise, no one would take it. What it did, though, is that I knew I couldn't sell it. It was just me, and I never thought of myself as a sales guy. So I created a distributor channel for it, and I was no more than a couple weeks into it, and the very first question was, "Well, Gary, are you going to create demographics?" And I was like, "No, I think I'm going to build tools," and it's like, "No, no, we want you to do demographics." And so I kind of went straight back into it, and um, kind of never looked back.
I'm curious, how did you get roped into developing Mosaic? How did that story play out? And most people probably don't even know about that.
Yeah. Well, the suitor that we wanted to get UDS was basically became Experian.
Hmm.
So Richard Weber and Paul Watts in the UK had built Mosaic in the UK and a few other countries in Europe, and they wanted a Mosaic US version. They also recognized that they didn't have the kind of intimate knowledge of demographics in the US to do it, and they also needed somebody to sell it. So we basically were approached whether we wanted to build it or not. They knew that I'd been involved with the segmentation system in Canada. Uh, so when CCN and Experian became one and the same, it was just a natural thing that Richard said, "Would you like to build this?" And we had a very good relationship for a long time where I was basically supplying Experian with our demographic estimates and projections. I was building the Mosaic segmentation system for them, and we had kind of arrangements in place where we respected each other's boundaries. And the
Hmm.
boundaries were, if it's list based, they get it. If it's geographically based, I get it. And so I built I'm going to say three iterations of Mosaic. Um, I built. So I built one for the 90s, one after the 2000 census, and then the last time that I built it was after the 2010 census. There were always some tensions, or there were tensions that started to emerge as to what that product should look like. Um, where Richard and I and presumably the folks at Claritas all viewed this as being geographically centered.
Hmm.
The list side of Experian wanted to be list centric, which meant that what they really wanted to build was a household classification, not a geodemographic segmentation model. So
Hmm.
there was always some tension, and there was always this kind of tension within Experian between those two groups. So the UK people were geographic based, and the Irvine people in California here were list based. And over time, the list people became stronger in the directional push of the product. And, we kind of resisted a lot of things for a long time. Um, but after the 2010 census, the version of Mosaic that came out was, I would describe it as a hybrid, where I yielded enough to keep the list people happy. Um, Things kind of went different on us though when Experian went public, and all of a sudden you've got the quarterly SEC filing that's due, and little things tend to matter. And there was this disconnect, at least I think in the minds of the Experian people, where the people who were looking at the numbers, they would see money going out to AGS and not
Mm-hmm.
seeing the product that I was building for them, which I didn't charge them for. They never got a bill for me building a Mosaic for them. It was their trademark, but I built it. And that was a good arrangement between companies that were privately held. But when they went public, that became untenable because they looked at it, they only saw one half of the equation. And
Yep.
so it was kind of inevitable that things would start to unwind. And we kind of knew that they wanted to go in that list classification much more heavily, and I didn't want to go there, so we kind of parted ways on that, and I built Panorama instead, which was what I called at the time old school geodemographic model.
Cool. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Gary, is you gave me an analogy a while ago about what it was like developing with the data with Experian, using both the list data and the geographic data, and you talked about it as using a joystick but not being able to see the video game on the other side. Can you tell me about that?
Well, one of the things that with Experian, everybody associates them as being a credit bureau, and you go, they have all that income data. And the problem was that the laws are set up so that the Experian marketing services, so the list side of it, could not use that data. It's walled off. So how do you attach an income estimate to a household if you're not allowed to look at the data? And what we did, and this is like 25 years ago, is we said, well, do we have data in common that we can use? And if that's true, then can we build a model using that data that we're allowed to look at of the income data which we're not allowed to look at? And so what we did is we did a two sides of the wall. On the the financial side of it, so the credit score side, we built the regression estimator. What we passed in was the parameters. So imagine a wall with a hole in it, and I'm sitting on the one side. I can't see the income data. What I can do is pass in, here's the form of an equation, and I can pass in the parameters attached to each coefficient. I can get back an R squared. So I can get back the goodness of fit. So what I did on my side of the wall was I built a kind of search algorithm which would twiddle all the dials. So we kind of decided, okay, we're going to use these 10 variables, and you twiddle the parameters on each of them systematically, and watch how the coefficient of fit behaves, and you're trying to optimize that. And we came up with a model. I mean, the R squared was pretty good. And then what we did is we said, okay, now we have to balance this and make it look like the census data as
Oh,
much
that's
as possible.
interesting. Yeah.
Um, and there you discover where the flaws are, and there are many, because income as stated on a credit report and income as measured by the Census Bureau are different. Just
Hmm.
like census income and IRS income don't match. Right. So you've got definitional problems. You've got the fact that I can't see that data. You've got the fact that there's error in both sides of that data, where people lie on their credit application, or they don't have information for one person, or some other piece is wrong. But what you could do is come up with a model where you could attach an income to a record in that mailing list. It's not great, but it works better than what you had.
So what was happening? Tell me if I'm right about this. You had developed a model and you were basically sending that model through, and you were given an R squared, like how close was I at it? And eventually you got it to where it's like using a couple demographic components, you were pretty good at getting a good R squared based on the people's income as reported by the credit bureau. Am I understanding that?
Yeah.
Now, is that on an individual level or is that on a geographic block group level?
No, it was on an individual level.
Okay. And then the next issue you had to do is you would get some at an aggregate level, the block group level, some data that didn't make sense as it relates to the census. So you had to do a little bit of normalizing
Yeah.
against it so we can line up nicely with the census.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of the difficulty of marrying very different data sources. Um,
Yeah.
measuring what you think is the same thing in different ways.